I'm a newer high school teacher, and juniors and seniors I teach, and struggling as I realize that high percentage of young men who are just making the claim of deism, and I'm trying to bridge that gap. And I've got resources, but looking for some bridges, some podcast things that will relate to these 17, 18-year-olds, because it's a little frustrating when I hear kids say they've been going to Catholic school for 12 years, they've heard it all, and they struggle with a personal God. So they describe themselves as deists. And
yeah, sure, absolutely. I really do have a very good alternative for you. So a kid that goes from sort of traditional Catholic piety to deism, in my judgment, never understood the Catholic doctrine of God to begin with. And I understand the move, like philosophically, or rather not philosophically. I understand the move existentially. I understand what would motivate someone to leave off Catholic, sort of traditional Catholic piety, and move into what they understand to be deism, because the anthropomorphic God of their imagination that has so often been the subject, or perhaps I should say the object of their imagination when they engage in that piety, is the proverbial white man with a beard, sitting on the throne with thunderbolts. And even if they don't have that particular image in mind, they're relating to God, when they talk about it personally, to relate to God in a personal way, or to have a personal relationship with God, does not mean that we think that God is a person in the same way that we are persons. Right? So all of the kind of peculiar attributes of personality that we associate with humanity, the emotionality and the passing states of emotion and changes of thoughts and discursive reason and physical presence and the sort of punctuated interventions in historical moments, all those things that constitute human personal interaction, none of that really applies to God. And so in your life, when you begin to find out that reality is just a lot more vast than the rather truncated vision of God that you were relating to in your pious imagination in childhood, and the bubble bursts and you begin to feel maybe disoriented or somewhat disillusioned with that picture of God, and you've never been given an alternative. You only have the anthropomorphic God of childhood imagination, and the only alternative to that seems to be deism or atheism. Well, that's a very rational move, right? I mean, I get why someone would make that move. The problem with that is that they've never really encountered the Catholic doctrine of God, which is so much more profound than deism, which I consider to be like the philosophically sophomoric view of theism, right? Because deism is a mechanistic God who stands apart from his creation as an object, the way an artisan would stand apart from an artifact. He makes it and sets it up and then walks away from it. And one should see at a glance that is actually just as anthropomorphic and philosophically restrictive as the granddaddy God with the beard, right? Because how can the cause of all being step away from anything?
Yeah.
Right? You see what I'm saying?
Sure.
That deism sort of imagines that there's this space called reality in which there are at least two kinds of objects, God and then other stuff. But we both occupy the space called reality. And it sort of takes for granted that there is this thing called reality in which we both live, in which we both operate, God on his side and we on ours, without ever wrestling with the fact, well, where did the reality thing come from if God is just an object within it? But that's just not the way and that's why I say it's kind of anthropomorphic and a bit sophomoric to think of it that way. Yeah. But that's not the way Catholics think about God at all. Catholics, the technical definition of God is subsistent being. It's the very act of being itself. That's what we mean by God. And St. Paul put it well in Acts 17, God in whom we live, move, and have our being. St. Thomas Aquinas in the Summa Contra Gentiles says in one place that God is virtually all things. God is virtually all things. What does that mean? Well, it's sort of like the relationship between the axioms of a proof to its conclusion. If you ever took geometry and you know how to reason from axioms and propositions to a geometric conclusion in a geometric proof, right? The conclusion is contained virtually within the axioms and the propositions. It has to be spelled out, but it's contained virtually within. St. Thomas says God is virtually all things. So you sort of see the nature of the analogy that he's drawing, right? That we talk about creation out of nothing, creation ex nihilo. But I think there's a real sense in which we could also talk about creation ex deo, right? In that we came out of nothing insofar as we didn't come out of some pre-existing matter. But we didn't come out of nothing insofar as we came out of God. And so in another place, Thomas uses the Neoplatonic language of emanation, that reality is an emanation. Reality as we experience, the temporal, changing, passable reality, is an emanation from the unchanging, eternal God. That's very Neoplatonic, right? But he does use that language in some places. And so our relationship to God is more like the relationship of, say, we talked about geometry earlier. Imagine if you've worked out the proof and you decide to diagram it on a piece of paper. And then you imagine, well, what are the conditions that make that possible? I mean, how is it that I can actually diagram the proof out on paper? Well, there's this theoretical construct called a plane that necessarily exists at a theoretical level in order for me to conceptualize the proof. Mm-hmm. The plane is just the thing that makes the rest of geometry possible. It's that in virtue of which geometry can happen.
It's the OS.
Yeah, exactly. Well, in this analogy that I'm drawing, God is the plane. God is that makes the rest of everything possible to be. God is the condition of the world's intelligibility. And so, how to convey this to young people, right? Well, one has to get clear on the doctrines oneself. And for that, I think some philosophical texts in Catholic philosophical theology would be helpful that really would undermine deism altogether. Nobody does a better job of this, I think, than Edward Feser.
Yes.
Right. So Feser's got a bunch of books. His book, The Last Superstition, his book on Aquinas, his blog, his philosopher's blog, Edward Feser Blogspot, is just a magnificent resource for philosophical reflection on questions like deism and philosophical theology. Magnificent book by the Orthodox theologian David Bentley Hart on the doctrine of God called The Experience of God. All of these would be great places to go. C.S. Lewis's essay, Transposition by C.S. Lewis. In fact, a lot of Lewis's nonfiction works, when he deals with the doctrine of God, are very understandable to an adolescent audience, but actually have quite a bit of philosophical depth.